The mastermind's background. Let me introduce you to the unlikely mastermind behind one of America's most audacious bank heists, Albert "Benny" Romano. Born in 1932, Benny grew up in the sweltering neighborhoods of South Los Angeles, California, tucked between sun-baked boulevards and the humming sprawl of the city. The son of Italian immigrants, Benny's life began with hardship. His father, a stonemason who moved to California chasing construction booms, died in a job site accident before Benny's 4th birthday. This left Benny's mother, Lucia, to fend for herself and her young child in a country where language and opportunity rarely welcomed outsiders with open arms. Lucia, determined yet weathered by the relentless stream of bills and expectations, soon remarried. Benny's stepfather, an ex-Navy machinist named Frank, was a stern and distant figure. Life in their modest home was heavy with unspoken tension. Lucia tried to fill the void left by Benny's father, working double shifts at a garment factory in downtown LA, while Frank enforced discipline with gruff words and a military sense of order. Their apartment, crowded with Benny's 3 younger half-siblings, rarely saw moments of real warmth. Instead, Benny learned early on to rely on himself, slipping out at dusk to explore the alleyways and markets, sometimes skipping school, sometimes helping shopkeepers unload crates to bring in a few spare coins for dinner. Resourceful and street-smart from a young age, Benny became known in the local blocks as a boy who could find anything. He pocketed odd trinkets and occasionally bigger prizes, sometimes just for thrills, sometimes as awkward tokens for the girls he admired during the sticky, endless summers. One time, at age 12, he managed to sneak a record player out of a pawn shop back entrance, carrying it across 3 streets just to impress a neighbor's daughter. Though he was caught more than once, arrest seemed like a distant consequence in a world where survival felt more pressing than school grades or future ambition. While other kids dreamed of playing for the Dodgers or cruising the Pacific Coast Highway in a gleaming convertible, Benny grew fascinated by stories of outlaws and gentleman crooks whispered about in the neighborhood barbershop. His favorite tale was of a Depression-era bank robber who, rumor had it, handed out cigars and 20s to astonished bystanders. For Benny, crime wasn't just desperation, it shimmered with the allure of autonomy, daring, and a ticket out of poverty. By high school, tension with Frank boiled over. The rigid structure of 1950s American family life didn't suit a restless teenager with bigger dreams and a deep-seated resentment for rules he never wrote. At 17, after a particularly explosive argument, Benny forged his mother's signature and enlisted in the U.S. Army. For Lucia, it was a heartbreak. For Benny, it was escape, and the beginning of a wild, winding road that would eventually lead him, decades later, to the vaults of Miami's wealthiest banking clientele. That's the story of Albert "Benny" Romano's beginnings, neither villain nor hero, but a survivor molded by the hard sidewalks of Los Angeles, chasing his own shot at the American dream. The choices he made next would set the stage for one of the boldest crimes in modern American history. The grueling path to adulthood. Benny's adolescence unfolded under the tightening grip of post-war America, a world hungry for conformity but riven with contradiction. At home, his relationship with Frank remained fraught. Authority was a wall Benny always tested. By 17, after a string of clashes and restless nights spent gazing at the city's flickering skyline, Benny forged his mother's signature and enlisted in the army. For him, the military was less about patriotism and more about escape, an exit from the cramped apartment and a family he felt never quite fit him. Basic training at Fort Ord was harsh, but Benny adapted quickly, toughening up and learning discipline the hard way. Shipped off first to Korea as the war wound down and later to far-flung bases through the Pacific, Benny discovered the double-edged sword of military routine. Structure kept him moving, but monotony made his mind wander. While some fellow soldiers wrote home about sweethearts and dreams of college, Benny found solace in poker games, late-night hustles in barracks, and the smoky haze of off-base speakeasies. If there was a shortcut, Benny sniffed it out. His service record was a patchwork of commendations and reprimands, bravery in the field but also sheer recklessness in the face of authority. After getting wounded in a minor skirmish, Benny spent weeks in a military hospital where boredom led to a near-fatal error in judgment. He got caught trying to swipe liquor from the supply closet, an infraction that landed him in disciplinary barracks. Discharged with little ceremony, Benny returned stateside just as the civil rights era was beginning to crackle with urgency. He bounced between coastlines, odd jobs, and wrong crowds, falling in briefly with small-time crooks and fringe political groups that thrived on the nation's growing undercurrent of unrest. For a stint, he became a driver for a radical paramilitary group in the urban cauldron of 1960s Chicago, ferrying leaflets and sometimes more questionable packages in the trunk of battered Chevrolets. The law was never far behind. Petty crimes led to short stints in county jail, but Benny's luck and sharp tongue usually spared him from more severe punishment. By his late 20s, struggles with identity, bad relationships, and mounting criminal associations weighed heavily. Watching friends fall to addiction or endless cycles of incarceration, Benny doubled down on his streetwise instincts, determined not to become just another statistic of American disappointment. It was a decade wandering on society's edge, marked by hardship, fleeting thrills, and the slow burn of ambition. Every scraped knee, botched scheme, and jailhouse conversation added a new tool to his kit of survival tactics. It was these crucibles, and the hard-earned wisdom of knowing when to run, fight, or charm, that would shape Benny into the man bold enough to someday mastermind the heist that turned him into a legend. The turning point of a lifetime. After a long stretch of restless, trouble-marked years and several stints behind bars, a pivotal shift finally arrived for Benny in the summer of 1968. Exhausted by near-constant instability and the revolving door of jail cells and seedy motels, he knew instinctively that he needed more than just another fast hustle or get-rich-quick scheme. He craved a fresh start, a legitimate escape from his checkered past, and the ghosts that trailed him from city to city. By then, Benny had married his longtime girlfriend, Grace, a soft-spoken nurse with a hopeful spirit that seemed to counter the chaos of Benny's world. The two made a pact to leave behind the toxic swirl of Chicago's underbelly and set out for the vibrant promise of Miami, Florida. To them, Miami was more than a mere change of scenery. It was a shot at reinventing themselves, new names, new careers, a hopeful future far from the shadowy networks and petty crime scenes of Benny's youth. They pooled their scant savings and bought a modest seaside bungalow on the outskirts of Miami. Here, with Grace working long shifts at a downtown hospital, Benny tried his hand at running a small poultry farm. He rose with the dawn, tended to hens and chicks, fixed up the rickety barn, and sold eggs to local shops. For the first time in his life, structure seemed within reach. The slow, methodical rhythm of farm work began to smooth the ragged edges of his soul. Neighborhood kids sometimes visited, drawn by his easy storytelling and surprising kindness. Grace, more than ever, seemed convinced that they could leave the past behind. But Miami in the late 1960s was an odd crossroads, its communities filled with booming wealth, rising crime rates, and endless reinvention. For Benny, the whiff of opportunity hung everywhere: motels filled with snowbird millionaires, lavish garden parties thrown by jewelry heiresses, and the arrival of eccentric celebrities looking to build fortunes or hide them away. Despite the peace that farm life offered, Benny's itch for more, security, respect, genuine prosperity, never fully disappeared. After a few years, inspired both by Grace's encouragement and his knack for charming people, he took a leap and opened a high-end photography studio in downtown Miami. He dressed sharp, invested in top-of-the-line cameras, and swiftly earned the patronage of the city's wealthiest socialites, bankers, and international investors. His work hung in opulent living rooms and graced the pages of lifestyle magazines. Business thrived. People admired his ambition, and admired even more his ability to make everyone feel like they were the center of the universe. Yet through the long, humid evenings, Benny sometimes found himself restless again, walking the neon-lit streets, wondering if he could ever fully shake the pull of risk and the thrill of chasing the next big thing. The paradox was always there, in the comfort and success he'd built, a lingering thirst for something greater, riskier, and more definitive. Little did he know, all those years of reinvention, observation, and adapting to life's crooked alleys had prepared him for the moment when a single overheard conversation would set his life and the legend of Miami's great bank heist irreversibly in motion. Rumors of a treasure in the bank vault. As Benny settled into his new life in Miami, whispers of extraordinary wealth began to ripple through the city's buzzing nightlife and backroom gatherings. On one sultry summer evening, Benny found himself at a dimly lit bar favored by the city's eclectic mix of hustlers, expats, and aspiring tycoons. The air hung heavy with jazz, the distant clinking of glasses, and the soft thrum of ceiling fans fighting a losing battle against the Florida humidity. Benny, nursing a bourbon neat, was eavesdropping more out of habit than intention. blending into the background as seamlessly as he always had in strange new places. At a table nearby, two sharply dressed men, visibly tipsy, leaned close over a pair of half-empty tumblers. Their low, conspiratorial voices nonetheless carried just enough that Benny caught something unusual. References to a highly secretive vault housed in the lower levels of Miami National Bank. They laughed about the bank's flamboyant cigar-chomping president who supposedly bragged at parties about keeping more than just local fortunes secure. There were stories of treasures stashed by international playboys, infamous politicians, and mob bosses who needed their assets hidden away from prying eyes. The vault was described as a modern fortress, designed to be immutable against even the slickest of thieves. Its catalog of safe deposit boxes overflowing with diamonds, gold ingots, cash, and endless priceless memorabilia that seemed to mock the very idea of security. This wasn't just idle bar talk, Benny realized. The way they spoke, weaving together inside jokes and alarming specifics, suggested they knew more than they let on. He listened intently as the men recounted tales of trusted guards, round-the-clock surveillance, and a time-locked vault door said to be impenetrable. Yet, even as they boasted about its security, one of them couldn't help but mock the complacency of the bank's board and security staff, hinting there were holes in the system if you looked close enough. For Benny, raised in the shadows and ever attuned to possibility, these rumors lit a spark that refused to die. He spent the next weeks methodically piecing together gossip, chatting up bank tellers at local coffee shops, and quietly observing the comings and goings near the massive marble building downtown. He compared notes at social mixers, fishing for reactions whenever the subject of the bank's vault drifted into casual conversation. Patterns started to emerge. Certain armored trucks arrived at odd hours, high society figures who never set foot in line anywhere else appeared at discreet side entrances. Sometimes, as Miami's luxury cars and neon signs flickered through the humid twilight, Benny replayed those rumors in his mind, pondering whether the stories were bravado, bait, or perhaps tantalizing glimpses of an opportunity bold enough to risk everything for. The seed had been planted. The notion of a hidden treasure vault, its riches just out of reach yet real enough to haunt his every sleepless night, became an obsession he could not ignore. For a man who'd spent his life reinventing himself, the prospect of one spectacular, life-altering heist began to eclipse every dream or doubt he'd ever known. Entering the underworld of banking. Benny's curiosity was more than just a passing interest. It was a compulsion, an itch that couldn't be scratched by rumor alone. Compelled to see the fabled vault for himself, Benny set into motion one of his most daring and creative acts of reconnaissance. Knowing well that anyone could walk into the Miami National Bank under the pretense of being a legitimate client, he forged a new identity, one built upon years of sly forgeries and a bundle of false documents he'd collected from old underworld contacts. A few precise handshakes and a small bribe to a clerk he'd identified as flexible made all the difference. Under the alias Richard Bennett, he scheduled an appointment with the bank's manager, presenting himself as a real estate investor seeking secure storage for sensitive personal valuables. Benny dressed to impress, a tailored linen suit, gold cufflinks, and an effortless Miami smile. The ruse worked. The manager, flattered and eager for business, personally escorted him down a private elevator and into the lower levels of the bank, through a series of security checkpoints and finally to the guarded vault. Nothing Benny had ever seen in his youth compared to the scale, or the subtle vulnerabilities, of that vault. The blast-proof steel door dominated the entrance, but Benny's eyes scanned for what most others overlooked, the way guards rotated shifts, the short-sighted placement of the cameras, and how the marble floor's scuffs pointed to certain patterns of movement. It wasn't the impregnable fortress people bragged about at Miami's cocktail parties. It was a challenge waiting to be solved. Benny paid close attention to the vault's interior layout. He noticed two older security guards, likely close to retirement, posted during the quieter afternoon hours, hinting at complacency. He asked to rent a safe deposit box and memorized its placement, cataloging the dimensions, distance from the exit, and the seeming randomness in box numbering. He also made mental notes about the electronic alarm system, the make, the model, and the nonchalant way a technician reset it every Thursday afternoon, right under the manager's nose. When Benny finally left the bank that evening, he'd mapped half the vault in his mind, and already spotted 3 potential weaknesses. Engineering a heist required more than brute strength or dynamite. It was about finding the human gaps, the loose hinges in supposedly unbreakable systems. The thrill settled deep in his bones. He wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was inside the belly of the beast, and for the first time, the world's most secure vault felt strangely within his reach. Inspired by detective novels. Benny's fascination with criminal masterminds wasn't just shaped by experience on the streets or whispered lessons from fellow hustlers. It was further ignited by the tales he devoured in dog-eared detective novels and pulp magazines that flourished in post-war America. These stories, penned by writers whose cynicism and creativity reflected a society wrestling with its own underbelly, became blueprints for thinking outside the law. Benny, restless in the humid Miami nights, would sit under the jaundiced glow of a kitchen bulb, absorbed in sagas of clever rogues whose triumphs danced at the edge of possibility and legality. One particular detective novel planted a seed in Benny's imagination. The protagonist, a cunning anti-hero with a penchant for puzzles, pulled off a heist by navigating the city's labyrinthine sewer tunnels, a feat accomplished not with brute force but with meticulous research and psychological insight. This wasn't just escapism for Benny, it was inspiration. He became convinced that the greatest crimes were puzzles waiting to be solved by those willing to examine the unseen angles. Each trick and tactic, fictional or not, offered a lesson, that every fortress has a crack, every safe hides a flaw, and sometimes all it takes is a fresh way of seeing the world. As Benny plotted his own audacious scheme, he sought out city utility records and engineering blueprints, much as his fictional alter edit would have done, scouring the Miami Public Works office, hunched over faded diagrams and city maps late into the evening. In the world of crime fiction, the hero's brilliance lay in their use of details others considered mundane. Benny began mapping Miami beneath the surface, charting the arteries and passageways that snaked below the streets, certain that somewhere in those shadowy blueprints was the vulnerability no one else had noticed. He didn't just mimic what he'd read, he internalized it, blending the paranoia and hopeful risk of noir fiction with his hard-earned street wisdom. When an acquaintance at a coffee shop boasted about the ease of acquiring public records with the right fabricated credentials, Benny recognized opportunity. Posing as a developer scouting land for luxury townhomes, he gained access to underground schematics and water main records, piecing together the literal underworld of downtown Miami. Instead of dynamite or drawn guns, his tools were questionably acquired city documents, a stack of crime novels at his bedside, and the belief that strategy and subtlety outweighed brute strength. Thus, what began as idle reading nights snowballed into the ingenious first phase of one of America's boldest bank heists, a plan born in equal parts from real-life hardship and the fictional capers of literary anti-heroes, proving to Benny once and for all that in both crime and literature, the sharpest mind always stood the best chance at rewriting the ending. Field investigation and planning. Benny's next steps were all about turning inspiration into actionable strategy. Driven by a restless blend of curiosity, ambition, and the quiet thrill of flirting with danger, he approached the next phase with a methodical and almost obsessive determination. No longer satisfied with merely collecting rumors, blueprints, or glimpses of the bank's interior, he became singularly focused on the precise, gritty business of reconnaissance, knowing firsthand that every legendary heist was made or broken by the tiniest overlooked detail. Night after night, Benny roamed the labyrinthine streets and alleys near Miami National Bank. He spent days parked in a battered Oldsmobile just out of sight, watching shifts change, guards yawn and grow slack, cleaning crews shuffle in, and security vans pull away after surreptitious midnight drop-offs. Patterns began to emerge like the subtle choreography of a city's inner heart. He made fast friends with a nearby sandwich shop owner, gleaning hints about which bank employees kept odd hours or were prone to sneaking out for a smoke. Each snippet of information, a surly janitor with gambling debts, an electrician known for working late, became another thread in his tapestry of intelligence. Thinking like a detective and acting like a stage manager, Benny started mapping the invisible schedule of the bank, which windows reflected security lights at what times, which loading docks were least patrolled, and where the city's infrastructure laced closest beneath the marble foundation. In the witching hours he donned old workman's coveralls, picked up from a thrift store, and blending in with late-night city maintenance crews, slipped into the storm drains and utility passages beneath downtown. Here he studied the echoing tunnels and made precise sketches of routes leading dangerously close to the vault's foundations. Boots squelching through ankle-deep water, flashlight in hand, Benny measured distances by counting footsteps and checked the thickness of walls by tapping his knuckles until a hollow sound told him he was closer than ever before. Back above ground, his apartment transformed into an impromptu headquarters, walls lined with blueprints, hand-drawn street maps, and lists of timings associated with every staffer he'd observed. He logged notes about weather patterns, when heavy rain might raise water tables and flood the sewers, or when Miami's frequent storms gave good cover for suspicious street activity. Over time, what started as scattered hunches and half-formed plans matured into a disciplined preparation process. He jotted ideas in the margins of library books, built a scale model of the block out of cardboard and matchsticks, and kept a thick file of Polaroids showing every entrance, alley, and drainage grill within a 6-block radius. At this stage, Benny's approach was almost scientific. He cross-referenced city tax records, pored over engineering diagrams in the public archives, and calculated the exact amount of earth that would need to be moved if a tunnel was to be dug. He analyzed soil samples under a cheap magnifying glass and sourced heavy-duty work gloves, construction masks, and other gear, ostensibly in preparation for a remodeling project he complained about to anyone nosy enough to ask. The process was not without setbacks. A close call with a suspicious security guard one night sent his pulse racing, but Benny played it off with a deft lie and a borrowed hard hat, further solidifying his reputation as just another anonymous face in the city's endless stream of hustlers and laborers. Throughout it all, discipline and secrecy were paramount. Benny confided in no one, not even Grace, aware that the slightest leak could jeopardize everything. He practiced the physical skills he might need, using borrowed tools. He cut and patched abandoned pipes, rehearsed stuffing himself through cramped crawl spaces, and timed himself on midnight runs through shadowy alleys. Bit by bit, the logistical puzzle of the vault began to make sense in his mind, and one singular, glorious image came into focus: the pathway to America's greatest bank robbery, veiled in darkness but, for Benny, now achingly within reach. Professional power recruitment. Benny's realization that such an ambitious heist would require a level of precision and expertise far beyond what he could muster alone sent him on a new mission, building a team as resourceful, ruthless, and invisible as the plan demanded. He knew from experience that the strength of any operation depended not only on skill sets, but on loyalty, secrecy, and nerves of steel. The Miami Underground, a swirling constellation of hustlers, craftsmen, and outcasts, was Benny's recruiting ground, a hidden world beneath glittering sunshine and palm trees, where alliances could be struck over whispered conversations in backroom bars or coded notes left at diners just before closing. Benny adopted the role of a clandestine headhunter. He started with those he had trusted on smaller jobs: a safecracker with a jazz musician's delicate touch and nerves unflappable, a burly tunnel engineer who once burrowed beneath downtown Miami to fix water mains, and a wiry electrician rumored to light up entire city blocks without drawing a single spark. He sought recommendations, always in code, never mentioning the true aim. Each candidate posed a risk, but Benny's intuition, sharpened by years at the edge, became his filter. He invited would-be team members to staged interviews, first at noisy cafes by the rail yards or rundown motel rooms that changed nightly, quizzing them on obscure details. Can you bypass a fail-safe relay blindfolded? Can you read a seismic meter through concrete? When a man freezes, do you keep moving, or do you talk him down? Those who passed the initial gauntlet faced a second round: elaborate trust exercises orchestrated in abandoned warehouses or mock break-ins in derelict parts of the city. Benny simulated high-pressure environments, observing how his recruits handled stress, failure, and the unexpected. Ruthlessness was prized, but so too was restraint. A single hothead could bring the whole scheme down. He kept his true identity ambiguous, paying out in cash, burning any record of phone calls, and instructing his crew to use only first names or nicknames that meant nothing beyond the job. As the roster solidified, so did the diversity of skills. A lock-picking prodigy barely out of his teens, a pair of twin brothers who once forged identity papers for Cuban refugees, now in charge of deception and logistics, a seasoned cook who doubled as chemist for handling nitroglycerin, a surveillance specialist adept at bugging security rooms and monitoring police frequencies. Each member was briefed strictly on a need-to-know basis. Benny shared only the puzzle piece necessary for that individual's role. Compartmentalization was their armor against betrayal or a panicked confession if things went south. Weekends were devoted to rigorous training. The team practiced timed drills on mock vault doors constructed from salvage, memorized blueprints until they could navigate blindfolded, and rehearsed rapid escapes in simulate scenarios Benny devised to mimic the chaos of a botched extraction. Special attention was paid to discipline. Benny insisted on a code of silence, an absolute ban on drugs or alcohol while on the job, and carefully controlled every element of communication. Cryptic signals flashed via car headlights, burner phones replaced weekly, and drop points for information swapped routinely. Even with his background in con artistry and crime, Benny was struck by the collective ingenuity of this army. Where one man's skills ended, another's began. A seamless network hungry for both the thrill and the spoils. He fostered camaraderie by emphasizing mutual dependence. No one outside the crew could even suspect what was happening. Each rehearsal was a test not just of physical skill, but of psychological resilience, trust, and the discipline to follow through, no matter the risk. As their preparations stretched on for weeks and then months, the group's cohesion deepened. Their secret meetings became a kind of ritual, their loyalty cemented by the profound sense that they were making history, not just robbing a bank, but staging a caper that their ilk would whisper about for decades. For Benny, recruiting and molding this hand-picked team was as audacious as any part of the heist. It called for tact, intellect, and a gambler's willingness to stake everything on a single, unrepeatable venture. To him, assembling his army was the most creative crime of all, an invisible work of art forged in the shadows, awaiting that single, perfect moment to spring to life. The action of stealing history. July 1976 arrived with an electric tension none of them could shake. By now, every member of Benny's crew was a practiced ghost, living as regular Miami citizens by day, then vanishing into the humid night to continue the excavation of their tunnel under tightly controlled secrecy. These weren't just any tunnels. Benny's planning, the engineers' calculations, and the sweat of the entire crew had created a subterranean artery reinforced with scavenged steel, poured concrete, and an obsessive attention to detail. The route was calculated so that beneath the city's feet, Miami's nightlife could continue obliviously above, while history was being rewritten below. Progress was measured in inches, not feet. With each nightly descent into the dark, claustrophobic passage, the team's nerves were tested. The whine of distant police sirens, the faint rumble of subway cars overhead, and the omnipresent fear that one wrong vibration might trigger a cave-in, or worse, alert someone topside. The tunnelers worked by lamplight and battery, always wary of moisture or an odd noise, their every move silent and purposeful. A silent code emerged between them, 2 taps for a problem, 3 for an all-clear. No detail was too small. Every shell casing from a power tool, every scrap of concrete was methodically removed and scattered far from the site, leaving behind nothing but untouched earth. All logistics, supplies, fresh air, makeshift supports, were meticulously scheduled. The group tracked Miami's typical police patrol routes and timed their surface arrivals and departures to blend in with late-shift maintenance crews. Work on the tunnel often lasted deep into the pre-dawn hours, and each session ended in a coordinated withdrawal to multiple safe apartments spread across the city. Secrecy was paramount. If any single member were tailed or detained, the entire operation would collapse. This constant pressure refined their discipline to a razor's edge. After weeks of back-breaking toil, the crew broke through the final layers of reinforced earth and concrete, halting just inches from the thick steel and marble foundation beneath the bank's vault. The final days were a feverish blur. Everyone worked harder and grew even more insular, communicating in whispers and hand signals. They insulated noise with blankets and foam scavenged from roadside construction sites, inventing their own tools where necessary. Moments of raw adrenaline became more frequent. The sudden snap of an old pipe, the distant bark of a security dog, the sickening uncertainty that they might be discovered at any moment. Yet Benny's unyielding confidence in the group's hard-earned camaraderie kept doubt at bay. The sense of being on the cusp of something epical, a daring surgical theft that had never been pulled off in the city's history, grew with each passing hour. They had rehearsed their break-in sequence relentlessly. Who would handle the breach? Who would monitor police scanners? Who would handle the take? And who would stay back to secure their escape route? Contingency on top of contingency was ready, and not once did anyone forget their code of silence. On the eve of the job, the crew gathered one last time in a candlelit basement, checking gear, reviewing the plan, sharing a silent, shared look that said everything. There would never be another chance. Executing a successful theft. The long-awaited weekend of the grand heist finally arrived. A sticky, feverish stretch typical of a Miami summer, punctuated by the city's firework booms and overflowing street festivals celebrating Independence Day. The atmosphere in the underground hideout was tense yet electric. Every member of Benny's crew double-checked their equipment: gloves, masks, custom-forged keys, bags labeled for specific loot, police radio scanners, even a battered cooler crammed with sandwiches and cheap soda for the overnight job. This wasn't just another robbery. It was set to become the most infamous heist the city had ever seen. In the very first hours of Sunday, as the city's attention turned toward beaches and backyard parties, Benny signaled to his team. It was time. Slipping into the tunnel entrance behind a row of dumpsters a block from the bank, they descended into darkness. Every footstep rehearsed 100 times in the weeks prior. Air down there was thick and earthy, but anticipation sharpened every sense. Benny led the way, flashlight arcing ahead, each man clutching his assigned tools. They crawled, duck-walked, and finally dragged themselves through the last reinforced portion of the tunnel, ending just behind the thick wall beneath the vault floor. For hours they worked, rotating between drilling, chiseling concrete, and operating custom dampeners to mute the cacophony of their tools. The tension was so stifling that even a muffled sneeze felt catastrophic. Finally, the wall yielded, and a jagged opening beckoned, barely large enough for the leanest among them to squeeze through. Benny, nerves of steel, was the first to slip inside with a roll of thick carpeting to both silence their landing and protect against silent alarms. The vault itself was even more overwhelming up close. Lit only by the crew's headlamps, rows upon rows of safety deposit boxes stretched the length of the chamber, the floor pristine except for a thin layer of dust. The air smelled faintly of ozone and stale perfume. Strictly adhering to order, Benny directed the crew into highly synchronized action. The safecrackers set to work in total silence, coaxing the tumblers open with a steady precision, while others plied open aluminum deposit boxes using custom tools designed to avoid sparking an alarm. They moved like a well-orchestrated dance, whispering only when absolutely necessary, moving according to the practiced plan. Time, in those vault-lit hours, warped between a blur and slow motion. The haul quickly outstripped even Benny's boldest estimates: gold coins, wads of foreign currency, gemstones in velvet-lined boxes, and private contracts typed in faded ink. Occasionally the team would find strange mementos: a locket with a faded photograph, a bundle of old love letters, even a pearl-handled pistol wrapped in silk. To anyone else these discoveries might seem sentimental, but to the crew, they were only part of the legend. Throughout the operation, Benny's pulse raced, equal parts fear, focus, and a rare surge of triumph. He closely watched the time, aware that they had a window of several hours before dawn, when the city above would once again stir and security sweeps would resume. Their plan factored in the bank's antiquated alarm system, disabled for maintenance as Benny had manipulated weeks earlier, and the sporadic security patrols, each one accounted for in meticulous notes taped over the vault's shadowed corners. At precisely planned intervals, duffel bags were loaded with the most portable, untraceable items: diamonds, gold, cash in various currencies, and passed down the tunnel to the designated runners. Smaller treasures were tucked into insulated lunchboxes for stealth. Each team member checked off their assigned section, ensuring no time was wasted on boxes suspected of containing only documents or items too heavy to transport. Even as fatigue clawed at their muscles, discipline never faltered. They hummed softly under their breath, finding solace in the mechanical rhythm of theft. In a moment that later grew into myth among Miami's underworld, Benny paused the frantic work to allow everyone a brief surreal celebration. Right there in the vault's cool shadows, the crew shared a small wordless meal. They broke sandwiches, passed a flask with trembling hands, and grinned at the absurdity of it all. For a few heartbeats, they were not criminals, but outlaws on the precipice of legend, savoring the taste of victory beneath the unblinking gaze of silent security cameras. Once the haul reached its predetermined threshold, Benny signaled the exit. With surgical efficiency, they wiped down every surface for prints, scattered a decoy trail with inexpensive jewelry bought at pawn shops, and rigged a minor distraction outside a service entrance, further confusing any inevitable investigation. The team melted away as dawn stretched over the city skyline, first through the tunnel, then dispersing across pre-planned routes by car, bike, and even on foot, disappearing into ordinary Miami just as effortlessly as they had arrived. What remained was a crime scene that would stun the authorities Monday morning, one with no broken doors, no forced alarms, and a mystery that would baffle not just police, but an entire nation for years to come. Investigation and pursuit of the perpetrator. The Monday morning after the heist sent a shockwave through the quiet corridors of Miami National Bank. The vault, once considered impregnable, had been emptied with a finesse that left the stunned staff and local law enforcement in disbelief. Within hours, police sirens wailed outside the marble facade, crime scene tape was strung up across the front doors, and detectives in wrinkled suits fanned out in desperate search of clues. The initial investigation unfolded in chaos. Reporters swarmed, snapping photographs of grim-faced bank officials and flashing badges at weary security guards. Detectives canvassed both the vault chamber and every conceivable entry point, dusting for fingerprints, photographing bootprints, and collecting even the most innocuous scraps of thread or debris. Their early theories ran wild: an inside job, an international syndicate, maybe even a renegade government team. Beneath the professionalism, an undercurrent of embarrassment ran through the ranks. How could such a large-scale theft occur practically beneath their noses? The vault's state bewildered experienced crime scene analysts. There were no signs of forced entry or explosives. The only evidence of intrusion, a faint trail of dust leading to a corner of the foundation, where the ground felt subtly hollow. Within hours, police smashed through a storeroom floor and uncovered the painstakingly excavated tunnel, complete with stray tools, mud-caked gloves, and the faint scent of concrete dust. This discovery sent shockwaves up the chain of command. The scale and complexity of the operation dwarfed anything Miami police had seen before. A multi-agency task force formed almost overnight. Miami police, federal agents from the FBI, and even insurance investigators converged on the city, creating a command hub in a repurposed wing of the bank. They saturated the streets with plainclothes officers, questioned known safecrackers and tunnel engineers, and meticulously retraced each aspect of the crew's methods. Yet the investigation soon ran headlong into a wall of silence. Every person of interest clammed up, either out of fear or loyalty, or perhaps awe at the audacity of the crime. The tunnel itself became the focal point of forensic analysis. Engineers marveled at its structural ingenuity: reinforced shafts, makeshift ventilation, traces of municipal blueprints scrawled on grimy notebook pages left behind. FBI agents reconstructed the timeline by examining security footage from dozens of nearby businesses, only to find that the crew's comings and goings seemed invisible against the city's nocturnal bustle. The bank's own cameras, expertly evaded or disabled, offered precious few leads. Meanwhile, across Miami, tips and false confessions poured in. Crime hotlines rang non-stop, yet the task force repeatedly ran into dead ends. Even seasoned informants shrugged, unable to point to any of the usual suspects. The city's underworld was abuzz with rumors, but nobody seemed willing or able to give up Benny or any member of his elite team. Days blurred into frantic, sleepless weeks as investigators pored over every possible anomaly: a single muddy footprint in a maintenance corridor, 2 stray cigarette butts with a rare brand, a receipt for industrial tools from a hardware store miles away. Agents tracked shipments of tunneling equipment, questioned night shift workers, and traced every recent purchase of heavy-duty gloves and masks. Still, none of these clues fit together tightly enough to form a narrative. Suspecting international ties, the FBI ran checks against known criminal networks in cities from New York to Havana, but Benny's operation had left astonishingly few breadcrumbs. Inside the investigation, frustration mounted. At press conferences, stern-faced spokespersons could only urge patience, spinning theories that the crew would eventually slip up or try to fence the stolen goods. But beneath their calm, the pressure mounted. Miami, now the scene of the greatest bank theft in American history, stood transfixed as detectives followed ghosts. Behind the scenes, investigators grew obsessed with 2 urgent questions: who were the masterminds, and where had the loot gone? Each false lead, each anonymous phone call, each whispered tip from the city's criminal fringe stoked the legend even further, heightening Benny's mystique among both lawmen and outlaws. Eventually, a tiny misstep surfaced, less a glaring blunder and more the ordinary slip of fate. A disposable coffee cup, left in a safe house used by the crew, yielded a partial fingerprint when dusted by a sharp-eyed investigator on a hunch. Though smudged and faint, it was enough to earn a cross-check in national databases. Weeks later, a match triggered alarms. The print belonged to an old associate of Benny's, previously arrested for a string of minor burglaries, whose recent bank statements had aroused no suspicion, until now. A wave of quiet, coordinated arrests followed. Under the glare of questioning, one nervous crew member, ice in his veins now splintered by relentless pressure, broke after days of isolation. His confession was tentative, measured, but enough to give the authorities their first concrete outline of the infamous Miami tunnel heist. Benny Romano, the once vanished streetwise dreamer from Los Angeles, emerged from the shadows as prime suspect. Grace, his wife, proved untraceable, while several other crew members vanished into thin air, leaving investigators just tantalizing threads to chase. The investigation exploded into headlines nationwide. Benny's mugshot weathered sharp-eyed, graced newspapers and evening broadcasts, turning him into an instant folk anti-hero. Miami's detectives, shamed yet captivated, doubled down. Still, despite the high-profile arrests and mounting pressure, both the whereabouts of most accomplices and the bulk of the stolen fortune remained an enduring mystery, stoking the mythos even further. A surprising conclusion and the legacy of the case. The courtroom buzzed with electricity. The city's most talked-about trial was drawing to its dramatic apex. Benny Romano, gaunt, sharp-eyed, still exuding that odd dignity cultivated from a lifetime dancing on the razor's edge, sat before the bench. Reporters packed the gallery shoulder to shoulder, their pens poised for every twitch, each word. Prosecutors spun tales of criminal genius, painting Benny as a mastermind with nerves of ice and a code all his own, while the defense worked overtime to humanize him, a veteran, a survivor, a product of harsh environments. But if anyone expected a tidy Hollywood ending, they were quickly disappointed. In the trial's 10th week, right under the noses of armed marshals, Benny's cunning revealed itself one last, jaw-dropping time. Exploiting a loophole in courtroom protocol and leveraging a distraction in the holding cell, he vanished, leaving only a set of hastily discarded prison garb and a note scrawled with a quote from his favorite detective novel. The escape stunned the court and ignited a media firestorm. By sunrise, Benny's great vanishing act had become the stuff of national legend. Law enforcement scrambled to close airports and ports, but Benny, ever adaptable, slipped through, vanishing somewhere in the vast, tangled web connecting the Americas. Word eventually filtered in, sightings in Panama, vague rumors of Benny spotted along the steamy river towns in Colombia or Paraguay, always a step ahead of both bounty hunters and police. Those who claimed to have met him described a man quieter now, slowed by time but still quick-witted, sometimes offering stories to the youngest children in a sun-dappled fishing village, or passing anonymous letters of good fortune to struggling widows. If the man had regrets, he kept them for twilight hours in the pages of secret diaries no police ever found. Decades rolled by and Miami authorities continued to chase whispers, faint clues and anecdotes, never enough to close the case once and for all. Meanwhile, the legend of the Miami National Bank heist only grew, told and retold in smoky bars, true crime books, and eventually podcasts that speculated about Benny's ultimate fate and the whereabouts of the missing loot. Back stateside, the rest of the team faced an altogether different endgame. In the years after the trial, as investigators meticulously traced financial statements and passport records, some crew members were tracked down, pulled quietly from modest retirements in distant cities or nondescript foreign towns. A few were even recognized by old acquaintances thanks to a flurry of sensational newspaper articles. Yet by the time arrests took place, if they happened at all, statutes of limitations had expired. The law, once so merciless in its pursuit, now hobbled by calendars and aging suspects who mostly kept their mouths closed. What of the fortune stolen that hot July weekend? Despite exhaustive efforts by law enforcement, banks, and international agencies, the vast majority of the treasure was never uncovered. Some jewels and gold ingots surfaced at shady black market auctions in the 80s and 90s, and one or two high-profile art pieces presumed lost reappeared in eccentric private collections. But the great bulk of the take remained hidden, a tantalizing treasure map with no X to mark the spot. In the end, the case itself became its own kind of inheritance, a living legend that redefined what audacity and intellect could accomplish when pushed to their farthest limits. Benny Romano's saga inspired generations of would-be outlaws and investigators alike. The lines between guilt and genius blurred, and the myth of the gentleman thief returned to popular imagination, endlessly reborn with every retelling. Miami, city of sun and secrets, never quite looked the same again.